hard one, because once he sits down, it gets sort of comfortable. He does not want to get up again.
He wants to go with the body doesn't want to go. But I think he wants to see some fossils. And they want to probably see the kitchen.
Mm-hmm. They want to see what's done with the house.
For sure we've seen the floor. He couldn't walk in. He couldn't get out of the car then.
Oh, my goodness.
And we hope that you'll put it in your planning book to come back and see us again. When you have more time, and we do have a new exhibit in our current rotating gallery. It is called The Climate Change and Sea Level Rise. And what it is, it's all about our lovely little state of Florida and the last 70 million years to the present, and how Florida has dealt with climate change and the sea levels going up and down. And I'm thinking very positive, but I'm not sure if we're all going to make it in 50 to 60 years, where they're predicting that St. Augustine, well, of course you will, yes. Yeah, that St. Augustine and Miami and Fort Lauderdale are more than likely going to be under as much as 10 to 12 feet of water. So it is what it is, so we'll see how that works out. This is going to be through the end of May. And then after, just before Memorial Day, for 2.5 weeks, we are going to do the Art Teachers Art Exhibit that we've been doing every year for the last 12 years here at the museum. And it'll be Art Teachers Art. And the students here in Citrus County. Next Wednesday, on the 17th, it sounds like if you're interested, wear green, I guess. 9 a.m. Wednesday, Miss Kathy Turner is going to do the Inverness Walks. She's going to tour downtown Inverness, pick out roughly 10 historic buildings and give you some background and history and some interesting a way of looking at our history, because it actually did happen and it's very, very unique. I think you guys will really, really like it. Donation is $5 per person, so it's not much for what we're doing. Next Thursday, week from today, after only 1 year in absence, we are rescheduling the jazz concert for Joe Donato. And now you can see why we have the seats spread out the way that it is. So that'll be the amount of people that we're going to have for next Thursday. Kathy also wanted me to remind you that the Smithsonian exhibit is coming on June 26th. It'll be July and August in parts of September. And it's all about, of course, Florida and the waterways, and we're going to tie it in with the Save Our Waters Week, and we'll give you more information about that. And next week, we'll be giving you some great, hopefully, good information. Hopefully, like tomorrow, I'm getting, hopefully, my second shot, and everybody else in my neighborhood, and that things might be looking up. Again, we can't predict the future, but hopefully we can redo our summer concert from last year to this year. And in June, we got Craig Anderson doing 60s, 70s, and 80s music. In July, if he didn't stay out of those low places, Kip Sweeney as Garth Brooks is going to be here. And in August, Peter Alden as Elvis, because of course you have to have Elvis in the building. Okay. Yeah, so those are all upcoming events, and we hope that you all consider coming to one or more of them. Okay, tonight we have David Letasi, who's a paleontologist, and as you can see, he's brought a lot of literally artifacts and things, and he's going to travel and take us back into the last ice age and learn about Florida's first people. We'll discover how they survived climate change, and he'll compare the artifacts found here in Florida to places in around North America and actual paleontology artifacts. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you David Letasi.
I'm unmasked. I hope I don't offend anyone. It's hard to talk through these things, so I'm taking this off. Well, I'll stand up for a few minutes. I'm in the spotlight. Rarely have I ever had the opportunity to actually be present in the ghost of Elvis. And so I find that as an honor, and I know the historic context of this building with that movie. And that was kind of one of my favorite movies, and I don't know if it was yours either, but it was that pioneering spirit where people go out and they try to find new things for themselves and a land to live. And about during the Ice Age, at the end of the Ice Age, people from all over the world actually were traveling, moving, and following game herds and animals, and they were trying to find a place to live in the sun too. Sometimes it was very cold where they were living, and we'll be discussing that tonight about what happened and this pursuit of the paleo hunters of Florida. Now, this is an interesting program because this program is not a new program. I actually developed this program in 1973, and it was part of an Eastern Federation Conference of Archaeologists for the Michigan Archaeological Society, and it was to introduce the current research that was happening with Paleo-Indian technology in the archaeology community during the 1970s. And that was the old days. That was like when radiocarbon dating was, just about 15, 20 years old. And we were just starting to get the idea that people were living in North America during the last ice age. Now, this program that we did was in the 1970s, and then we did a second one in the 1980s. And during this program, I'm going to be talking quite a bit about some of the archaeologists that were in this early research in the 1970s, 90s, and right up through to today. And there's been a lot of work here in Florida because Florida has some unique conditions here for the preservations of artifacts and fossils. And the artifacts and fossils that I brought up here today in these cases are actually Paleo-Indian artifacts and fossils related to early man that's found here in Florida and the southeastern United States. Now, as I go through this series of slides in this program, you're going to see some of the photographs of these very same artifacts. And so it's kind of pointless for me to try to pick these up and explain to you now. You'll see them on the slides. But after the presentation, and we answer some questions for you, you can come up here and look at some of these artifacts for yourself. I do ask you that the specimens in the glass cases remain in the glass cases. Things accidentally break if you handle them too frequently. And these are extremely rare artifacts. And they're all authentic artifacts from this time period. Also, there's a little case to the right up there in the far corner by the paper towels that you may wish to use if you want to handle some of these specimens. But there's actually a case there of this early archaeological conference that we put together in the 70s with the actual prominent featured speakers that were involved in that early archaeology. And for some reason, they thought I did a fairly decent job putting that program together, so they all signed the speaker's directory and gave it to me as a presentation after the lecture. So I thought that was kind of nice of them. So when you get a chance afterwards, look at it. Now, behind me right now, as you can see, there's a map of North America. And North America during the end of the Ice Age, at least about 70,000 years ago, North America was going through various stages of ice ages. There was far more than one ice age in North America that started well around 2 million years ago. And we do know from dating and checking the terminal moraines of these glaciers that were moving from the north to the south, we can pretty well date what was going on, and there's fossil sites, and you can tell what kind of flora and fauna was associated with those glacial advances and retreats. And so at certain periods of time, the glaciers retreated, and we had what were called interstadials or interglacial periods, and it sometimes warmed up what was almost as normal as today. In fact, technically, geologists and archaeologists and paleontologists believe that right now we are in the middle of an interstadial or an interglacial period. So we hear a lot about global warming. There was actually an altithermal period about 7,000, 8,000 years ago that it was about 12 to 13 degrees warmer than today. So we're not really at the extent or the reach of the as hot as it could get. It can get much warmer. So anyway, there's that. But as you notice in this illustration up here on the North America, you'll see that to the right side or the east side of North America was under a vast ice sheet. And that ice sheet was as much as 2 miles thick in some areas, especially around the Hudson Bay area. We think that that ice sheet kind of originated from around the Hudson Bay region and then kind of spread and branched out. And then there was another area of glaciation was on the west coast of North America over the over the Rocky Mountain ranges, and that one, the Laurentian range, was just as deep, but it was a much narrower band. Now you'll see in this photo, this illustration, there's a green band that runs north and south, kind of like from Alaska down to the Great Plains area. Well, they believe that there, at certain periods of time during this last major glacial advance of about 70,000 years to about 18,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, that glacial ages, that corridor may have been open at various times. And the current view in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for people populating North America was that people were coming in from Asia. And that was one of the major current views. It was very difficult to imagine anywhere else because at various times in the Bering Straits, Beringia existed. It was a land area where animals and plants and people could actually migrate back and forth from Asia to North America. There were also these land bridges even during the age of dinosaurs. And we even have evidence of dinosaurs that lived in the late Cretaceous period that actually originated from Mongolia and Asia. So this thing had been going on for quite a few million years. Okay, now if I can work this. There we go. Now the thing that led a lot of scientists to contemplate who the first people were in North America, in about 150 to 100 years ago, a lot of people were finding, farmers, ranchers at that time, these strange points that are lanceolate-shaped points. They're beautifully manufactured. They have this flaking that extends from one side of the point to the other. So it's like they were intentionally trying to chip these artifacts where one flake would meet the other from the other side. And then they would take this long channel from the base of the point. Now I'd love to do a little pointer at this for you guys to show you, but unfortunately we couldn't get that to work on this system. But try to imagine the base of that point, which is the curved bottom of it, there's a channel taken out of it, and that's your classic Clovis point. And we know about these first people's points is because there were some sites in Colorado and out west that had these points, and they were actually associated with mammoth and extinct bison. So that kind of started these little Clovis points. But what's interesting is that we, in 2018, my son and I traveled out to Colorado to where this site was found. It's called Blackwater Draw, and it was found in the 1930s. And this started getting people to think, and archaeologists, that maybe there were actually people here living during the Ice Age. And prior to that, there were some people that were collecting around Missouri and other states, and they thought there might have been artifacts associated with mammoths and mastodons. So it started out nearly 100 years before this site was found, but it was poo-pawed by a lot of the archaeologists that, that couldn't be that old. But here we had the evidence by the 1930s where in this picture you can see there's some mammoth bones and a bison skull, and they're associated with the Clovis points. So that kind of was a no-brainer. Obviously, these people were associated with Ice Age animals. Now, even here in Florida, as early as 1915, there were collectors and archaeologists that actually thought that there were prehistoric people living here during the Ice Age. And in 1915, they were digging a canal over near Vero, Florida, and they actually found human remains mixed with Ice Age animal bones. And so that told these people that obviously some people were living here during the Ice Age with these prehistoric animals. But unfortunately, the people, the scientists at that time that controlled archaeology were vehement. They were adamant about people didn't live here that early. But here you had the skull. This was found by Dr. Elias Howard Sellards. He wrote a beautiful paper on it. I just reviewed this paper before I did this program and put it together for the Florida Humanities. And Dr. Sellards, he believed that clearly there was an association with prehistoric people with Ice Age animals living here, even in Florida, in this area. And unfortunately, the fellow from the Smithsonian, he dismissed that these prehistoric animals like the bison you see in the picture to your left, and the giant saber-toothed cats and the dire wolves and animals like that, there's just no way people were living here that early. And the guy that kind of was the head of all of this controversy was Alex Hrdlicka. He was head of the Smithsonian Institute. He was very vehement through a period of time in the 1910, 20, 30 period. He didn't believe that these artifacts really were associated with Ice Age man. But finally, he left the Smithsonian around 1940, and he started thinking, well, you know, I guess maybe I was wrong. There probably were people here during the Ice Age. So he even changed his view once the evidence mounted. Now, one of the early fossils that was found in North America was toted in the 1930s as Minnesota man. Of course, it wasn't a Minnesota man at all. It was a Minnesota girl. She was found in Lake Pelican Glacial Deposit, and she was under what they considered 18,000 varve layers of sediments, and they felt that she actually died in a glacial lake during the end of the Ice Age, and a lot of people thought, well, that can't be right, that just has to be too early. Well, recently they have been doing radiocarbon dating, and I hope all of you are familiar with radiocarbon dating. Anybody not have a clue what radiocarbon dating is? It's the new technique where you have radioactive carbon-14 when an animal dies or a plant, that unstable carbon atom breaks down, throws electrons off, becomes C12, and then if you find the difference of the amount of C14 to C12, you can kind of date and tell how old that specimen is. And now they're doing what's called a new calibration. Some of the factors involved in the dating of that process are off a little bit. So some of the dates that I'm going to give you coming up are calibrated dates except one or two. We're still going back and trying to date all of these old sites to see how far we are off on the dates on it. So recently, a lot of the archaeological sites have actually become significantly a little bit older than we thought they were. Now, one of the early sites here in Florida after Sellard's work down in Vero, Warm Mineral Springs. And the guy that way to your left, Bill Royal, he was actually one of the first divers here in Florida. He worked as a Navy diver, and he took his scuba equipment and used it in Florida after the war, after World War II. And he started diving in Warm Mineral Springs in the 1950s. And he went to the bottom of this spring, which you can see. Anybody been to Warm Mineral Springs? It's a beautiful place. They used to say Ponce de Leon hung out there because if you hung your tens in that water, it gave you regeneration and youth, you know, like the fountain of youth. But it's a warm mineral spring. It stays very warm and it has a lot of minerals in it, so it's very therapeutic, and it became one of these hot spots in Florida for people to visit. Well, he was diving in the bottom of that bell-shaped sinkhole, and as he was proceeding down to the bottom of it, he actually noticed that there were some cave formations in the side, and he looked inside that little cave formation and he found out that there were some human skeletons in it. And he thought, well, gee, that's kind of interesting. And so he reached in, he had to move a couple of the stalactites that were falling in front of it, the cave, and he grabbed a skull, and he thought, well, I'm going to take this skull to the surface. And as he was diving upward, Bill noticed that when he was holding the skull up, there was some ooze running out of the back of the skull, where the back of the brain case goes. And he thought, well, that's rather bizarre. It looked like Lux liquid soap. And so he thought, I better show this to the University of Florida. And so he showed it to a friend of mine, Dr. Dave Webb, up there. And they found out that it was actually brain tissue. And so because of the water level in that cave during the Ice Age, most of you all know that because of all the glaciers in the northern part of the continent, that the sea level started dropping down. So when the water level in that cave during the last Ice Age was much lower. So they didn't have to dive under the water to place that body. That actually was a dry cave, and they probably took ropes and they carried the body down and shoved it into that crevice of the cave. And so here now we have a Paleo-Indian site, and it has been radiocarbon dated to 10,000 years old. So it's kind of like at the very end of the Paleo-Indian period. And scientists believe that this Paleo-Indian period lasted from approximately whenever the first people came into North America up until about 10,000 years ago, and that's because the climate was changing. We are starting to get into a warmer period, an interglacial period. The glaciers were receding. But Bill Royal was one of the founders and one of the prominent fellows that came up with the facts that Paleo-Indians were living here even in Warm Mineral Springs. Okay. Now, another fellow, a few years later in the 70s, redove Warm Mineral Springs and found this saber-toothed cat tooth. So this is telling us that some of these Ice Age animals were in a direct association, even with those barrels, possibly as late as 10,000 years ago. Now, new radiocarbon dating, we kind of think that these sites are actually a little bit earlier than that. A lot of the extinction periods that we have with radiocarbon dating today are pretty much recognized at around 13,000 years. In fact, they kind of whittled it down to where most of the mammoths, mastodons, and the large extinct megafauna died out about 12,700 years ago. So anything that's a little bit earlier than the 12.7 period, they consider Clovis period. And the Clovis artifacts are dated between 13,200 and 12,007. So that gives us a kind of a window on what archaeologists thought for many, many decades were the first people to enter America and are known as the Clovis first proponents, advocates. Okay. But that was a saber that was found by Sonny Cockrell in 1976 in Warm Mineral Springs. And we have one up here that I'll talk to you about later. You want to check out the saber of the saber-toothed cat. Saber-toothed cat fossils in Florida are extremely, extremely rare. This saber you see up here is only one of 4 that have been found in Florida. There's a saber cat skull that was found near this area called the Marion County Sink, and it was a complete skull, and you'll see a picture of it later. But cats are extremely rare. We think that they may have interacted with humans during the end of the Ice Age. There's actually some evidence of cut bone at La Brea tar pits on saber-toothed cats, but no one's really done much publication on that recently. Now, another fellow in the 1980s that was really prominent here in Florida that brought about this concept of Paleo-Indians and these Ice Age hunters here was Ripley Bolin. Ripley Bolin was a state geologist, and he believed vehemently that there were early people living in here in Florida during the Ice Age. And he wrote several papers and books, and we kind of use him as a guide on what some of these early artifacts like Swanee Points and Simpson Points that characterize the Paleo-Indians that lived here during the Ice Age here in Florida. So Ripley Bolin was one of the pioneers. Unfortunately, Ripley Bolin passed before I ever had a chance to meet this gentleman. But most of the people that are coming up that I'm going to show you that led to the evidence of what's going on in Florida today with the pursuit of the paleo hunters, I have worked with them over the last 30, 40 years. Okay. And one of them is Dr. James Dunbar. Dr. James Dunbar is probably one of the leading archaeologists in the field of Paleo-Indians here in Florida and North America. I respect his work highly because I kind of nudged him in a few places to look for some of this stuff. In fact, he became a state archaeologist in the 1980s, and Dunbar really believed that there were Paleo-Indians living here in Florida during that time period of the last Ice Age. And I remember we were doing a very large archaeological show in Plant City, and I spent some time at that show, and we wanted to go to visit a amateur collector's artifacts collection. He had a huge collection. And so one of my buddies and Jim and I jumped in the back of a van, and another guy drove us over to this guy's house. And so we're talking with Jim in the back of the van, and I kept telling Jim that, I says, you know, if you go in these rivers like the Santa Fe River here in northern Florida, with the Coochie, which is right up the road up here, and other sites, you know, like the Swanee River, you find these little bone points that are mixed in with Paleo-Indian artifacts. And my buddy and I were saying to him, you know, if you find one of these points stuck in the bank of the river, when it's stuck and it's sticking out, the part of the point that's sticking out is weathered and worn. And then when you pull it out of the bank, the base of it is like glass smooth, just like the day it was manufactured. So these were stratified sites, and we tried to get Dunbar interested in that. And lo and behold, about 1982, 83, he started diving in the Santa Fe River and the Swanee River and wrote a paper testifying to the fact that there were stratified Paleo-Indian sites here in Florida. So that kind of is how I kind of fit in the scheme of some of this stuff. And Jim has written some really wonderful documentations and papers, and they're online, so you can check out his work. He's probably one of the leading experts in it in the state today. Okay, I got something that came up. I have no idea why it came up. I lost my... Let me see if I can get that off. Technical difficulties. I must have clicked on that when I was in that little spot. She'll get it ready for it. So anyway, so Jim started working on these sites, and he wrote a paper. And what was interesting on the paper, I had written a paper on it, the sites on the Santa Fe River in 1980, and I submitted it to one of our conferences we had in the Great Lakes. And several prominent archaeologists were very interested in the site. And one of the things I noticed on some of these points is that some of them are very thick and some of them are thin. And I recognized that some of them were actually manufactured from deer bone, and the thicker ones were from the metapodial, the leg bones of camels, Ice Age camels, prehistoric extinct animals. And lo and behold, he wrote the paper and he described the very same thing that I described in my other paper, that he believes some of those were extinct camel points. You'll get a chance to look at these. Okay, now let me see if I can do this without messing it up. Ben Waller. Ben Waller was an amateur archaeologist, artifact and fossil collector in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he was like Bill Royal. He had his scuba gear from the Navy, and he went into the spring heads here in Florida, in the Santa Fe River, and found thousands of artifacts. And a lot of the sites that we know of now in the Santa Fe River and the Suwannee River that are Paleo-Indian were actually first discovered by Ben Waller in the 1960s and 70s. And I did a lecture on saber-toothed cats for the Silver River Museum. Have you guys ever been up? It's a beautiful museum. And they asked me to speak on saber-toothed cats. And lo and behold, Ben Waller was one of the participants in the lecture. And I was able to meet Ben before his passing. He was a great amateur, and a lot of the work on the professional is based on his knowledge of the underwater recovery of artifacts here in Florida. So Ben was just a spectacular person. Okay, now more recently, like in the 1990s, a lot of the local archaeologists in the state are starting to look for Paleo-Indian artifacts, and this is a site that I'm very familiar with called Dames Cave. And I don't know if any of you folks have ever been down to the Withlacoochee State Forest off of 480. There's Stagecoach, and you go on Trail 22, and you walk into Dames Cave. And if you go underground in Dames Cave, you can find Paleo-Indian artifacts. Now, I do want to warn you that she's going back there. Unfortunately, that's state land, and you can't collect artifacts on state land or in the rivers. You have to have, they're out. You can collect fossils, but you have to have a permit. Anyway, this Dames Cave, I used to take kids on field trips. I used to work at Museum of Science and Industry in Tampa, and I developed a bunch of geology programs for their museum, and I used to take groups out to Dames Cave to do cave explorations. And one of my students actually found one of the 10,000-year-old points in the bottom of that cave. So they just verified what the archaeologists had excavated a few years earlier. They must have missed that one point. And the little boy, he was so disappointed that I told him, sorry, we're on state land. You have to put it back where you found it. I think he put it back where he found it, but I didn't verify or check on that. So I can't be 100% certain. I know if I was his age, I'd probably want to pocket it, but you know, we can't do that. We're trying to reserve and preserve these things. And one of the things that was found at that cave site was an artifact like this here. If you get a chance, you take a look at this. This is called an Oscilla adze. And there's an Oscilla River that's not far from Tallahassee that has produced thousands of Paleo-Indian artifacts, early Ice Age artifacts. And today the real key is, were there people living here before Clovis? Were there people living here actually prior to that 13,200 year period? And little by more, archaeologists are starting to find sites that have Clovis context And then below them, stratigraphically, they're finding earlier artifacts. So there's a good likelihood right now, in this year, there's enough evidence where I believe personally that people were living here at least 15, 20,000 or more years ago. So the Clovis were far from the first people to live here in North America. So I believe there was really a clear pre-Clovis context. When you get a chance to look at this Oscilla adze, this was one of the artifacts that's similar to this one that was found in that Dames Cave. This one was actually found on what's called the Norden site in Santa Fe River. And it dates probably around 14,000 years ago. Yeah, I believe this one is pre-Clovis. Okay. Now another fellow by the name of Dr. Dave Webb. I don't know if any of you ever met Dave. Dave unfortunately passed away last year. He was the head of the paleontology department at the University of Florida. And him and I became very good friends over the years. We worked on numerous projects together. And Dave started a project on the Oscilla River that I just spoke about. And they were finding artifacts on the Oscilla River. And a lot of them were actually in association with prehistoric animals. So Dave thought that this was probably going to be a pretty good area to start concentrating on Florida paleontologists and archaeologists to start studying the prehistoric sites on the Oscilla River. And some of the early archaeologists at that time are the prominent ones today, but Dave got this program started, and Dave was a really interesting guy. He told us, I always used to love his stories. He had so many wonderful stories about his fossil collecting days. The guy, Ben Waller, that I told you earlier, that was such a prominent paleontologist, archaeologist, amateur, he actually taught Dave how to scuba dive. And Dave actually went into a deep hole with Ben on the Santa Fe River, and Dave actually lost his bearings. Sometimes when you get in black water, you can lose your bearings in the water. And Dave had a panic attack, and Ben grabbed him and brought him slowly to the surface. And Dave always said, Ben saved my life, you know. So we were an interesting group of people. Had a lot of fun working with those guys. So Dave was one of the guys that he came up with the concept of the interchanges of animals moving from North America to Asia and South America. And Dave started the program on the Oscilla River for prehistoric people, and also with the animals that started coming from South America up to North America when the Isthmus of Panama opened up. Now, one of the fossil sites on the Oscilla River is called a branch of it's called the Wasissa River. And the Wasissa, an amateur collector found this bison skull, and the bison skull had a stone projectile point stuck into the top of the skull. And if you want to see it, it's on display at the Florida Museum of Natural History. Have any of you ever been at the, if you have, yeah, I took you there. But that museum, if you ever get a chance to go there, it's almost as good as this one, right? But anyway, this skull had that little point, that stone point stuck in it, and so Dave got really fascinated by it. They did CAT scans, radiology on it, and it actually radiocarbon dated 11,000 years before present. So it's actually like at the end of the late Paleo-Indian period. And what's interesting is they're doing a lot of studies on blood sampling of artifacts on stone tools. In fact, we have a gentleman here, Mr. Mark Moore, who's an engineer, and he was involved in some of these studies with blood remains on lithic artifacts. And they're finding that there's a lot of the paleo tools that are from the Clovis period have actually animal blood. They're also finding proteins and amino acids in the soils of prehistoric sites, and they can tell that somebody was in a site, whether it was a mastodon or a person, just by some of the residues in the soil. So we have a lot of new techniques coming up where we're going to be able to determine more and more when man actually entered North America. So this was an important piece, this bison skull, and it really led to everybody wanted to work in the Oscilla River and see what actually was happening in that area. And one of the things they found was called the Page-Ladson site, because the two guys that found the sites that were amateurs, Page and Ladson, were finding these artifacts in this one area. And so Dave started concentrating in this area to explore. and they actually found this tusk of a mastodon. And this tusk of the mastodon, where you see the black arrow, is where the junction of the root of the animal in its skull, jaw, and the pointed end would have been what was exposed. And the other part with the the blue arrow was where the root of the tusk was in the skull, and where at the very end of that blue marker were a series of cut marks. And so they believe that they were actually cutting that jaw open of that skull to extract the tusk. It's doubtful that they were interested in the ivory, but there's a capsule inside that tusk that's like a meat pulp, and it's very nutritious and it's delicious. And I think that's what they were probably trying to do, remove that for the marrow cavity. They would make mastodon soup. You know, they would take a big chunk of mastodon. You know, if you ran through all your mastodon meat that year, you know, you only needed one mastodon for a group. You know, that fed you a long time. And a friend of mine found out that they were in the Great Lakes. They would take these chunks of meat and wrap it up in the hide, the fur of the mastodon or the mammoth, and they'd put it in a glacial lake. Keep it cold. And a spring would work the same here in Florida. We wonder why there's a mastodon in every spring here in Florida. Well, they were probably hunting them here and then caching the meat to last most of the year. You could. This buddy of mine, I'll tell you more about him later, but he was experimenting. He was doing this. He was taking moose meat and caribou meat, and he was caching it, and he could hunt it like in the early fall, and all the way into the next summer, that meat was still fresh and good. So that he believed. And then when you started running out of the meat, you kept some of the bones, and then you break the bones up and you boil them and you make mastodon soup. You know, get the grease out of it, sort of. So in this site, you know, this particular tusk and the sediments next to it were dated at 14,550 years. Now, doggone it, that's pre-Clovis, you know. And so one of the points looked exactly like this. This was found in the association near the tusk, and the sediments were dated at that 14,500 year period. And so we believe that this site is truly a pre-Clovis site here in Florida. We're living in an amazing area here. Did you know up the road here, you guys know where Lecanto's at? You ever heard of Lecanto? You know there was a cave there called Sabertooth Cave? You ever heard of Sabertooth Cave? You have. This was found in the 1930s, and the American Museum of Natural History excavated that cave when they found out about it, and they found a saber of a saber-toothed cat, just like this one here. Remember I told you there were only 4 sabers in Florida here? Well, the one that was in the American Museum from Lecanto was stolen. So right now we only have like 3 of these sabers in our collections here in Florida. But that's what they were finding. That's what it looked like. They used a floating dredge system to bring the artifacts up. And the Page-Ladson points are these very strange points. They're almost flat based on the bottom, and they had the same broad flaking across where the 2 flakes met, and they had just a slight, almost indistinguishable shoulder on the sides. But these are classic, called Page-Ladson points. And this case here that we have here, that collection has 2 Page-Ladson points from the Norden site from Santa Fe River. So there's a good likelihood that the artifacts in this case that were all found together with these bone points that I was telling you about earlier were from the Page-Ladson period, about 14,500 years ago. There's definitely old stuff around this area. Silver Springs. Now, you guys are familiar with Silver Spring, Silver River Museum. In the 1930s, they found a mastodon skeleton at Silver River. Guy Merrick, he founded the Silver River Museum, wonderful person. And Guy found some mastodon remains in the Silver River as well. And Simpson points, which are classic artifacts found here that are considered Paleo-Indian. I think they're pre-Clovis, but some people think that they're later. Okay. The first mastodon excavations went back a long time here in North America. Here's a mastodon being excavated in New York State in 1799. So at that time, the prominent paleontologist in North America was Thomas Jefferson. And Tommy thought that mastodons and mammoths were still living in North America. And so he believed that we will find these prehistoric critters here out west. And when he sent Lewis and Clark out there, well, Clark was a good friend of his, and he trained Clark. You know, that's part of your family, isn't it? Yeah, to train him in taxidermy so that when he went out there, he could bring a mammoth back, taxidermy mammoth. They didn't believe in extinction back then. Okay. Now here's a bone, and I don't know if you can tell that, but this is the end of a rib bone, just like this rib bone up here of a mastodon. And it has a bone point stuck in it. And this point is dated at 13,800 years old. It was found in Washington State. And you can see the blue arrow there that would be to your right is where the rib sticks out of the backbones, and the point was wedged right into that point between the dorsal spines of the mastodon vertebrae and the rib. And that would have been a perfect where you threw a spear and it went like this and sailed right into the back of a mastodon. A lot of people poo-pah and they say, no, that's the tusk of another mastodon that penetrated it in a fight. Well, that'd been nice if a mastodon could get up that high and make that angle, have to have a broken tusk, and furthermore, the elements in the bone point are bone, capillary bone, not ivory. So that's not really realistic. So this is one of the evidence where people in North America on the West Coast believe that there was people living here during the Clovis period. Okay, now here's some more examples of the point, and you can see the lower picture to your right where that white long object is sticking into the bone. That's actually the point. And the point would be very similar to what you see with these points we find here in the Santa Fe River and the Swanee and the Withlacoochee and some other areas. And this is pretty much how they may have used these points. The points, let's see, that'd be to your left would be how it was hafted onto a spear. They used probably sinew and tree sap to attach him. And then the points to the right side of the screen, those are the cut, sharpened points. And they're found on Clovis sites, and they're found here on sites that are at least as early as the Page Lassen artifacts. We haven't found those in situ yet, but that'll be the next thing they're going to look for, something in a direct association. The Pleistocene interchange, we have this view yet that people were coming in from Asia across Beringia, and that they were following these nomadic animals across from Asia to North America. And of course, there were a lot of very dangerous animals living with the people back then. There was a short-faced bear, which was about twice as big as a grizzly bear. I can't even imagine a bear that big. There were camels, horses, a lot of horses. In fact, one of the earliest artifacts that we find here with blood residue on it was found off the coast of Maryland in Chesapeake Bay off in the Atlantic coast, and it had camel blood on it. So we believe that that was a 17,000-year-old point where they may have actually butchered a camel. Unfortunately, most of the blood residue we find here in North America, the number one animal, the most common animal blood that has been tested so far on Paleo-Indian artifacts is that dangerous, gigantic creature called a rabbit. And it's most likely that rabbits were easy to catch. You could snare them and trap them. They were everywhere you went. If the mastodon ran out or the fishing quit, or if you couldn't find a bison over the next bluff, you trapped a rabbit and you had dinner. People in England love rabbit. They eat more rabbit than anybody I know of. So here's what Florida was like during the Ice Age, and it was much different than it is today. And you can see the black outline of Florida during the Ice Age when the water level was about 200 feet lower than it is today. And there was this long, huge, flat prairie to the west of the peninsula of Florida. And it was probably at that point in time grasslands. The black line is now being researched heavily by some of the archaeologists like Jim Dunbar. He's been working archaeology underwater, and they're starting to look at the mouths of the rivers where they entered those old channels that are about 50 feet underwater on this shelf, and they're finding Paleo-Indian artifacts out there in the Gulf of Mexico. So during that time period, the people during the Ice Age, when the water level was so low, they were actually hunting mammoth and mastodons in those areas, okay? And that's what it was like here. Now, one of the earliest sites in North America that was started in the 1970s, in fact, the fellow that started working at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in western Pennsylvania did a lecture for me. In fact, you can see his autograph up here on this paper. He actually worked on the amateur archaeologist, collector, found the site. It was in a little cave on his property. He notified the University of Pennsylvania. They started looking at it, and ultimately James Adavazio decided to work on that site and found out that some of these points were 17,000 years old on the bottom levels of that rock shelter. In fact, he says there were 20,000 years of sediments laid up in perfect sequence at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. So Jim, he's a brilliant guy, and he knows what he's doing. I remember he told me, he said, Dave, most wonderful thing, he says, I didn't know what I was going to do as a project. I wanted to make a field school in archaeology, and he said, all of a sudden a donor came up to me and handed me $1 million and said, you can do whatever you want with it. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, that's why it's there today. And these are some of the artifacts that have been found, especially around Maryland area and the central Gulf states, central Atlantic states. And they vary between about 14,000 years ago up to 20,000 years ago. And so a lot of these have been radiocarbon dated in some of these early sites. The archaeologists in Maryland, they're arguing vehemently, is it pre-Clovis or isn't it pre-Clovis, or it's not as old, or your dates are wrong. You know, you're not doing proper technique, and you hear the same things from the archaeologists. But little by little, we're starting to see that there's more and more evidence showing that people were living here quite early in North America. Okay. Now, one of the godsends to archaeology is coming up pretty soon. We just talked about radiocarbon dating, but there's another one called optical luminescence. It's optical stimulation luminescence, where they actually can study the sand particles and grains of silica in the soil sediments, and they can determine the radiation level of those elements on the age of that. I'm not a physicist, this guy over here. If you're not sure how this process works, raise your hand, Mark, he'll explain it to you. But this is a new current research. It's been around, what, 25, 30 years? Yeah, he started the pioneering of it. This guy's been around. Leslie's been more around than him. Okay. Now, we met this wonderful gal, Dawn Jones, through Mark. And Mark's always tantalizing me with different artifacts and things that he finds, in his career. And one of them was this little gal, Dawn, found this black point. And Mark said, I think this is early. Dave, what do you think? And we wrote a little write-up on it, right? And then we sent it to Dawn. And now the archaeologists in Maryland are all buzzing about it and arguing about it. Is this really early or not? And I believe it's a Cactus Hill point. There's Dawn with her point. And I just had the opportunity to meet her, what was it, a week or so ago, a couple weeks ago. But these artifacts that we're finding now, even in Maryland and Florida, are clearly showing that there has to have been people living here far earlier than the Clovis people during this ice age. One of the keys, too, is studying the bone. We have cut marks on a mastodon rib up here you can look at. And obviously the bones are telling us something, that people were modifying bones of prehistoric animals. And sometimes we just don't always get radiocarbon dating. And so we have to kind of depend on interaction of tools on bone. So that's one of the studies that's currently going on. Some of the earliest points, there's a new hypothesis that Dennis Stanford from the Smithsonian Institute brought up about 25 years or so ago, 30 years ago, called the Solutrean hypothesis. And he believes that a lot of the artifacts that we've been finding in North America, the tool assemblages, and you'll see some of the tools here. These tools from this site up here in this case look identical to the tools you see in France and northern Spain from 18 to 20,000 years ago. And so Dennis came up with this wonderful idea that these lozenge-shaped points and some of the earlier points actually were people that were traveling from Europe to North America, which is kind of an interesting concept when you think about it. Okay, here's Dennis Stafford. When I was out in Colorado and we were looking at the Blackwater Draw artifacts, the director of the museum came up to me and she says, "Day, I hate to tell you, but Dennis just passed away." And so we lost Dennis in 2018. But he was one of the most brilliant archaeologists in my mind. And these are some of the paleo artifacts he studied over the years. He also noticed that there were a lot of bone points and tools that were very suggestive and similar in North America to the ones found in Spain and France from the Solutrean period. And now I am same thing again. I must have pressed too hard on the little button. I'm going to shorten it. My wife is so worried about the time. We don't want to put anybody to sleep here tonight. Okay, thank you. So here's one of the bone foreshafts from Ohio. This one's been dated over 13,000 years old. They believe that there are possible atlatl points where they were used with a spear thrower, and that was probably the early technology. These people were able to impale a mammoth or a mastodon. These are the Solutrean points from, oh, it did it again. I swear I'm not pressing that hard. I did it again. I'm pressing too hard on the little clicker. I'm not used to this mouse. I'll try to be very gentle with it. That's all right. I'll try to be very careful. Okay, so here's the concept in a nutshell. Dennis believes that people were coming across the Atlantic from northern Spain and France, and they were using the margins of the ice sheets to travel. And he believes that they may have been using boats. And so that's an interesting concept. A lot of people don't, archaeologists, they don't like the idea that people are using boats that early. But we do know that the Australians were probably using boats as early, the Aborigines, about 40,000 years ago to get to Australia from Malaysia. So it's not unheard of. But one of the most interesting things that I recently read was an article where in Norway, northern Norway, that they actually released an Arctic fox. And they had a radial collar on this little female Arctic fox. And she actually, in 68 days, traveled across the ice sheets over to Greenland into northern Canada in 68 days and traveled 2,200 miles. Could a person do that? Yep. Okay. Cactus Hill, Virginia. Another early paleo site that's believed to be pre-Clovis. Raise your hand if you've ever worked on that site. That's why I dragged him here tonight. This site here is, has artifacts that go back at least, 17,000 years, right, they believe? So it's a very early site.
They backed it up 2 more thousand years ago.
Yeah, like 19, yeah. And the Simpson-Swanee tradition was here in Florida. That's what the points look like. And there's a case of them right here. And the concentrations of artifacts of these points, there's a bunch of them, the dark black areas in the north part of Florida. The top one is like where the Osceola River's at. Santa Fe River's the middle one. There's one right along the coast in the middle of the map, and that's with the Coochie River here. And then there's a bunch of sites around St. Pete and Tampa. So there's a lot of Paleo-Indians, like the Norden artifacts, the ones in the case right here. And these with the Page-Ladson points may go back 14,000 years. Okay. The Anzac burial, every now and then Paleo-Indian artifacts are found in burial sites. The Anzac site was found in Colorado, dates 13,000 some years ago, and it has all kinds of artifacts from this early Clovis period. And these bone foreshafts. So this is kind of a signature in the Paleo period these bone artifacts, broken bone tools. In fact, this artifact here was fractured the same way to use as a handle. That's horse bone from the Norden site, probably 14,000 years old. They used handles and tools and bone and wood. One of the points up here is actually made of cypress wood. Now, why would they find in this area? Right down the center of the state in that black strip is phosphate deposits and sinkholes. And you guys are all familiar with sinkholes. Sinkholes are a great place to find chert and lithics. If you're a technology people that like using stone tools, you go to the sinkholes and you find flint. And we have wetland preservation here, so these karst deposits and rivers preserve the bone. Also, in the southern region, like Pinellas County and Tampa, a lot of artifacts, like the Simpson points that Bolin first described. Here's a series of Simpson points I discovered in Tampa in the 1970s. Mammoths and mastodons have been associated with some of these artifacts, like Silver River. Pinellas County has large concentrations of Paleo-Indians. In fact, the artifacts you see here are in the Florida Anthropologist. It's a paper, a book you can look up online, and a lot of the prominent archaeologists' work is in this. We also found, and there we go again, another site that I do want to discuss briefly, but that's pretty much it, is the Bocosiga Bay area. The camel bone was found on this site. I was first introduced to this site in the 2007. They asked me when I was working at Tampa Museum Mosey, Dave, we found some bones in a creek bed over in Pinellas County, so they had me go over there, and I look at it, and I thought, this site was going to be a couple of teeth, bones like that. And so the director of the park, Millennium Park, she says, oh, they're in the shed over here, which is like a 6-bay shed for their tools and tractors. And she opened it up, and the entire floor of that shed was covered with bones from one end to the other. And I said, well, my gosh, you got a bone bed. This is like La Brea tar pits, And I said, there's camel and horse and bison. And bison is a classic indicator. It's late Ice Age. So we had a late Ice Age site. And then so the University of Florida got interested in the site after I wrote a little glitch on it, what was there. And they found a camel bone with cut marks on it. And just down the street where I collected the sabers, that was from the same fill. So that saber's pretty much associated with this site. And so let me see, I got just a couple more. There's a saber. And I do want to mention this saber-toothed cat. On the base of the skull and the bottom of it, there's a hole punched into it. And archaeologists are now believing that this skull may have actually been punctured by a spear by a saber-toothed cat. Now, that's a little bit of a stretch, I know, but that's what they're looking at. Now, they're looking at these things. This one was found in Marion Sink. This is the finest saber cat skull that was ever found in Florida. It was actually sold to a private collector for $350,000. So it's no longer in the scientific domain. So now we just have a few teeth. And this one was actually radiocarbon dated to 19,990 years. So about 20,000 years. And recently, in the last 10 years, Paisley Cave in Oregon, you never know what you're going to find. Human poop. And it was a DNA analysis and dated for about 14 to 15,000, 16,000 years. So just evidence like that, we know people have been here a long time. Thank you. Any questions? And I'm going to have to sit down because my legs have locked up.
You said that the saber-tooth was punctured by what?
A spear point.
A spear point.
It's like that bison skull. They had that bison point, the actual lithic was actually stuck in the skull. This one, the way it was punctured, the only thing they could believe would have done that would have been a spear. The sabers, I have saber-toothed cat bones in my collection where a saber cat bit another saber cat, but it really looks different than that. So they think it might have been a human did it. But the thing is that more and more of this evidence. We have sites up in northern Canada, up there near Old Crow, which is near the Arctic Circle. A guy I knew back in the 70s was finding bone there that he was radiocarbon dating back to 28,000 years ago. So there's a good likelihood that people had entered America at least 30,000 years ago. But there's a friend of mine, Danny Fisher, and Danny's an expert on mammoths and mastodons, world leading expert. He's done a lot of programs for me, and we've worked together for years. And Danny is working on the Ice Age mammoths from Siberia that are frozen, you know, like the little baby mammoths. And he has a site out in San Diego, California, and they actually dated, and they didn't use radiocarbon dating because it's too early, but it was, they dated it 130,000 years old, and they believe that humans actually butchered and rendered this skeleton. And the problem with that is there's this idea of out of Africa was about 100,000, 130,000 years ago. So if humans were just coming out of Africa, then who was in North America at that time period? You know, was it a Neanderthal? Was it a Denisovian? Was it a, you know, a Homo erectus? It's really strange. And I've known Danny for years, and he's a straight shooter, and he doesn't mess around. He doesn't take research. He takes it very seriously, and but he's convinced this is a 130,000-year-old rendered skeleton. We don't know when people first came.
How is it that brain tissue was still there after all that time?
It's called anaerobic conditions. And what happened is on that level in that cave deposit, and a lot of people don't realize we have all this wonderful drinking water here in Florida. Well, we used to have a lot of, right? Springs have had a rough time recently, but there's all this spring water in our aquifer system, and it's in those same cave systems that was in Warm Mineral Spring. And the calcium carbonate in the limestone here in Florida kills bacteria. That's why you can go in the bottom of a spring if it's a nice clean spring and take a gulp of water. It's perfect water. And so because of that, there was no organisms growing in that skull. It didn't disintegrate or rot. And there's a site called Wendover site. Have any of you ever heard of Wendover? Wendover is very famous. Wendover, that dates about 8,000 years ago, and they found another Wendover near Port Charlotte just recently, and they're working on that, and it's kind of hush-hush, you know, they don't want too many people knowing about it. And it's also producing artifacts that are similar to Wendover, and the burials in Wendover, which were many burials, and they had brain tissue in those, and that was, again, the anaerobic conditions in the burial, underwater burial. And that's the reason why Florida is so wonderful here. It's because we have these wetlands that preserve bone and wood. And so there's very few places in the world that have the preservation like Florida has. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Anything else? Anything that's piqued your curiosity?
The saber-tooth cave that we talked about in Monsanto off of 491, is that the same as Jeep Cave?
As what?
Jeep Cave?
I'm not familiar with the terminology of Jeep Cave. The only thing I've ever seen in the literature was Saber-Tooth Cave. Now, if you want to know where it's at, when you go on the corner of 44 and 491, are you familiar where that's at? And you notice where all that excavation was on the northeast corner? That's where it used to be. It's no longer there anymore. It's probably under sediments, but they just terraformed that whole area and it doesn't exist anymore. But they have several thousand artifacts and fossils from Saber-Tooth Cave in American Museum of Natural History. I'm going to petition the American Museum to send them to this museum, that they belong back in Citrus County. Also, I'd like to thank Lindsay for inviting me. Lindsay Gilbert was instrumental in putting this program together, and I really do thank her for the invitation. Anything else?
We have one question from our audience online. Linda Myers wanted to know where the Paleo people ended up. If the Paleo-Indians
Yeah, they just continued to survive. What happened is the people that came here and their genetic stock, because you know, the one site, Anzac, that I told you on the slides from Colorado, they did a DNA analysis of Anzac, and that was Asian origin. And so that remains had to be reinterred through the Native American Acts, you know, where they repatriate. And so that was from that area of Asia. So it's clearly that people were coming, part of the people were coming from Asia. There's some genetics that were found, DNA, in the Wendover people, and that DNA was a very obscure type of DNA profile that they don't want to say it's Caucasian because it might upset some apple carts, but it seems like it may have been Western cultural DNA derivative. So that's making some archaeologists feel that there was a migration from Europe to North America. But as these people progressed from the early Paleo-Indian period before Clovis through the Clovis, then they went into this terrible time period called the Younger Dryas. It was a very dry period, and that's when the extinctions were starting around 1207. And those people survived. They were still here, but their culture changed, their artifacts changed. So when we find a Clovis point, and then you find agate basin points or Folsom points, they're a little bit later in the Younger Dryas period. And then North America starts getting warmer, but the same people are here, but they changed their technologies, and they started using stem points. And so we consider that the archaic traditions. And so they continued. They were survivors. That's what's interesting. We are very concerned about global climate change, but believe it or not, the majority of people survive a lot of different things in the world. We haven't become extinct yet. I don't think we are. We do have to change our ways, but I'm not holding out to say we're going to disappear that quickly. We're pretty tenacious as a species. Any other questions?
Go along the same lines. The time differentiation between pre-Clovis and Paleo-Indian, is that when they melded together when they changed, or?
Well, if you had two genetic pools, one coming from Asia and one coming from the West, from Europe, then there may have been some interbreeding, and there's a good possibility of that. But here's the thing. We don't have enough evidence of human remains. There's only very few burials from that time period. You could probably put the bones that we know of those people in a shoebox. You know, there's just very little evidence. And so it's going to take just the right circumstances and the right site, like they found in Israel. The caves there were Neanderthals mixed with Homo sapiens. And then you find something that looks like a hybrid, you know, genetically, where there's so much of, even current research today, they think all of us in this room have some Neanderthal DNA. My wife thinks more than others in my family, but so it's just something that has to be proven. And like I say, these protein residues and acid residues in the soil stains from detritus, feces, different animals. The beginning of archaeology is really starting right now. And it's not the old school archaeology. It's modern research with genetics, you know, chemistry. You know, these are the new tools. I'm the old school. I'm going to be gone soon and obsolete, and the new kids on the block are going to start coming up with all these new testings and methods. It's just, I'm seeing the beginning of it, and it's really an exciting age we're living in to see what's going to happen. We're trying to figure out our origins with the human species, and North America is another one where when did it really happen? And we have this site now, and I'm not going to name the name of the site. I'm terrible with those Mexican names where they have the Chilachachachachach. But it's found in near Mexico City, and it's dated 30,000 years old with human remains and tools. And then there's paleo sites in South America that go back 14, 15,000 years. So that's pre-Clovis. So if Clovis was the first, what are those guys doing down there, you know? So just like a lot of us are feeling that these people are here quite some time.
Do you have any insight into how the DNA testing we're doing among people today?
About the DNA testing? Well, I've been watching a lot of lectures on that lately, which is pretty interesting. And the DNA research, you know, they're trying to find out on given populations their origins, because, you know, people are migratory beasts. No one likes to stay in the same place. So everybody, like, you know, Susie and I, my wife and I, are from Michigan originally. And, of course, we came down here to Florida almost like 45 years ago. And so we're not from where we started out. And I bet you almost all of us here are from somewhere hither. And so, you know, we're mixed. We're kind of mutts. We're kind of mixed. I love the new DNA sampling. People are so convinced that they're this genetic origin, and then they find out that they're this other 30%, and they go like, I can't believe that, you know. And so what? You know, technically under the skin, we're all pretty much the same, you know. And the DNA testing, it's really interesting because you're starting to see the origins of people, where they came from. We have a high level of assuming things that are not always really right, and we think someone's always from somewhere else, and we find out, not exactly, you know. So we're learning a lot. And as far as like the origin of man with the DNA, like going back so many generations, you know, and we start to see this level of like the DNA statistics go back where you can get a human sapien like 200,000 years ago. And then they find tools like in South Africa that are like 190,000 years old, and bones, you know, skeletal remains. And so we're starting to see this picture where the human species of Homo sapiens were like 200,000 years ago in South Africa. And that for some reason, for about 70,000 years, they couldn't get their act together and migrate far north. They kind of wandered around Africa for about 70,000 years. And then for some reason, I guess there was some pioneer Homo sapien that says, I think I'll go east up through the, you know, Sudan over into Saudi Arabia. And then they started coming out of Africa. And those dates have been Mark got me into this. He had some artifacts that he was trying to tell me were 130,000 years old. So I started looking up all these sites from North Africa, and it was like 130,000 years ago, these people were just starting to head out of North Africa. Yeah. Yep. That's right. And so, you know, we're going to see a lot of new things. There's going to be a lot of new stuff coming up. DNA is part of it. There's so much. There's so many new technologies coming up right now. You know, this CAT scan, they're CAT scanning everything. The new datings are getting better. You know, it's really interesting. I'm here. You got me when I'm here. Yes, please come up. Look at the artifacts. If you have a question, I'll answer your questions of what you're looking at there. And there's a mammoth tooth. There's a mammoth tooth. And the one rib there, that when you look at the rib, there's actual cut marks on that rib from a flint tool. So that's actually associated with early humans. And this one case here, my legs are back to normal now. They woke up. This case here is really interesting if you get a chance to look at it. The bone points are actually real bone points from the site. And we think that they're mostly camel and deer. And there's a little raccoon tooth which was in direct association with this tooth. But this tooth is the most important tooth. It's actually that little tooth here, the camel tooth, that's a camel tooth. And it actually has the cut marks from the knife blade of these tools that manufactured that little camel tooth. And I have another camel tooth from a camel that didn't get butchered, and it has a huge thick root on the back. And these Paleo-Indians actually carved that root into a point and use it as a little perforator. So these are kind of the artifacts we look for on these early sites here. So you get a chance, take a look at that. And the saber cats, I found this. This was in, this saber came out of the Kellogg Fill, which is near Treasure Island down there near St. Pete. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that area. Just happened to be looking along the bank of near the hospital in the 1970s, and it was dredging from Bocosiga Bay, where the other site I was telling you about, and it's a late Ice Age saber cat. You don't see many of these, so get a chance to look at that. And the artifacts on the end over there are 2 Clovis points. They're actually Clovis points. Hand sanitizer and paper towels. If you're afraid handling it, just, you're welcome regardless.